Welcome. I think a couple of our colleagues will still be joining us, so if you'll indulge them and let them sit next to you in the row as they enter, I would appreciate that. But we do want to be judicious with your time, and so I'd like to formally begin here by introducing myself and adding a word of welcome to you. My name is Jay Hine. I direct the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives here at the White House, and you are participating in a monthly series called Compassion in Action Roundtables, which we have launched this past January and hold each and every month to talk about the Bush Compassion Agenda in its many forms. Washington has been called a lot of things, but I don't know that it's ever been referred to as Oz before. But you may have felt that a bit today as you've gotten blown around by the wind, and I know that that's conflicted with some of the travel that you all had to probably experience a bit of delay, if not here, perhaps on the other end of that. So we're thankful for your commitment to join us, particularly those of you who are visiting from out of town, and indeed we welcome you here to the White House. I mentioned our roundtable series. The first several of them featured such difficult social problems as prisoner reentry. 700,000 prisoners reenter communities near you every single year. The challenge of making that work in a healthy way so that they don't return again to prison is enormous. We talked about malaria in this room a couple of months ago. 1 million children a year die of malaria in Africa, which is a preventable and treatable disease. These are difficult problems. These are problems we need to be burdened by more, so we need to understand their proportions better. That's part of our intent with these roundtables. And we need to find hope in the stories of the faith-based and community organizations that are solving these problems. And our aim with the roundtable then is to do those two things at once, to define the problem more clearly and to encourage you by way of local success stories, but then to place that in the context of a smarter and bigger and better national conversation about how we move forward. We'll have future sessions on homelessness and the full range of social issues that Americans face and communities deal with. None of these social problems could have success stories attached to them if volunteers didn't exist, if citizens didn't participate in the process. Enlightened business leaders who through their corporate social philanthropy or social responsibility didn't act, or private volunteers who just got outside their homes and into their neighborhoods and into the lives of the needy neighbors around them, or the countless other opportunities we have as citizens to be engaged. Policy reform wouldn't work without this ingredient, and indeed communities wouldn't be made healthy without it as well. President Bush understands this, and I'd like to describe his vision for you very briefly and talk a little bit about some of the action that we're doing here in Washington at the White House, and then turn the podium over to two very distinguished speakers who are leading this work so that they can enlighten you on their activities and the federal government's response overall. However, before I do that, some of you may have noticed in the news coverage today that a horrific crime took place in Blacksburg, Virginia, at the Virginia Tech campus. A gunman, I don't know if it was more than one, opened fire at a couple of locations, and as I understand, maybe 35 people are already claimed as victims in that tragedy. And so I think it would be very appropriate for us just to have a moment of silence before we begin our formal program. So please join me. Our best wishes are extended to the Virginia Tech family. Upon his inauguration, the first time in 2001, very early on in that calendar year, at the inaugural ceremony, President Bush echoed the Ask Not theme of John Kennedy, and he spoke directly to citizens, and he said, and I quote, "What you do is as important as anything government does. I ask you to seek common good beyond your comfort, to defend needed reforms against easy attacks, to serve your nation, beginning with your neighbor. I ask you to be citizens. Citizens, not spectators. Citizens, not subjects. Responsible citizens, building communities of service and a nation of character. Americans are generous and strong and decent, not because we believe in ourselves, but because we hold beliefs beyond ourselves. When this spirit of citizenship is missing, no government program can replace it. When this spirit is present, no wrong can stand against it, end quote. Steve Goldsmith was one of the architects of this vision, and indeed of its programs. You will be hearing from him in just a few minutes. It was very appropriate that Mayor Goldsmith helped bring life out of that vision, because he was a very innovative mayor that acted upon it in, I'm very proud to say, my home city of Indianapolis. And mayors are very fond of saying that there's really no such thing as national poverty. The poor are real people who live in real communities like Indianapolis, and that needs to be acknowledged when we consider social problems and response to those problems. But we also need to acknowledge the other side of that equation, that volunteers and people that serve them are real people who live in real communities. And so how does the federal government, this big, oftentimes impersonal apparatus, serve in such a nimble, sort of personal way? Well, I haven't fully figured it out myself, but Steve Goldsmith had, and so he'll be speaking to that a little bit today. But it is indeed that question why my office exists, the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. It's indeed why, post 9/11, Desiree Sales' office exists, the USA Freedom Corps. These, and Desiree will host a panel shortly and describe to you more of their work. But our offices don't run programs, and we don't spend money. We're a leadership engine to try, on behalf of the president, to bring life to this vision and to serve the federal agencies who are operating on its tenets, and indeed, most importantly, to the nonprofit leaders and the private leaders who are in communities trying to work this out on a day-to-day basis. It does take all of us, of course, to solve social need. It takes enlightened business, as I said before. It takes government. It takes community. Academics refer to this as multi-sector social change. And to make that work, we need to understand a couple of things. We need to understand the premise of today's session, that it's built on a citizenship framework, that it takes real people serving their neighbors. We also need to have a healthy appreciation for the sectors that are involved. There is a synopsis of research in your program today that is prepared by the Council on Economic Advisors, which talks about the scope and scale of the nonprofit sector. There is 1.5 million organizations, and annual revenues of these organizations equaling $670 billion a year, and assets held by these groups amounting to $1.7 trillion in total, which would make the nonprofit sector in the United States, and I'll acknowledge Diana Aviv, who is here and who will offer closing reflections at the end of today's event, and who represents these leaders such a fine fashion. This nonprofit sector that he just described is, in these assets, would equal the 6th largest economy in the world, which is just remarkable. We need a healthy and appropriate understanding of that sector. You'll hear today probably the term a couple of times that volunteerism or charity is perhaps nice, but it's also necessary. This is a substantial sector we're talking about. This is a business-driven sector, business by way of its principles and focus and outcomes. At least we need it to be, because we need it to perform at a high level if we're solving social problems. They're the greatest problems and opportunities to serve that we have. The faith community within the sector is enormous, and we need an effective and proper understanding of our faith institutions as well, vis-a-vis their service to neighbors. One of our panelists today will represent very innovative faith community. She and her husband are both here from Mariners Church. You'll hear from her, and her husband, senior pastor, leads that church and its spiritual mission. But Lori Bishore, who you'll hear from, leads its community or physical or human mission in their community. They were a part of a very innovative leadership class that I think provides an interesting snapshot into the proportions of the faith institutions and their community service. Of these 24 megachurches, if you're familiar with that term, these are larger, enterprising, non-denominational, oftentimes churches. There was a group called the Leadership Network in Dallas, Texas, that identified a couple dozen of the most enterprising among them, of those who were doing what Leadership Network referred to as externally focused ministries or ministry beyond their walls. And Lori will speak specifically to her story today. But of the 24 churches that participated in this leadership cohort, in year one of a 3-year participation cycle, these groups in year one, as they entered this, this initiative, had collectively, 24 churches, remember, 13,250 people served among them of 24 churches, which is a very impressive number. 3 years later, because of the strategies that they shared with one another and the new skills that were built as a part of this exercise, they served collectively 23,000 and 467 people in their communities, which is an impressive increase of 77%, but an astounding number that in 24 communities, 23,000 people are being served by these private enterprises called churches in their communities. Collectively, too, behind the people served are the hours of those dedicating their service. There were 360,000 hours served collectively by these 24 churches on the front end of the initiative, over 1 million hours of service to their community by these 24 churches 3 years later, again, as a result of their participation in this leadership class. 189% increase. But as you know, the independent sector numbers, the $18 or so equivalent of a volunteer hour for 1 million volunteers is a big number, $18 million worth of monetary value. That's just a snapshot within one sector, the faith sector within the nonprofit sector. We need to be encouraged, and we also need to be better at it. We can be smarter, we can be better aligned the more that our sectors unite, and government shares information and strategies, and the nonprofit sector asks questions and participates more fully in their communities. So to teach us more about that, how it's being done, and perhaps where we need to go next, we have invited the leaders of the Corporation for Community and National Service to speak to us today. First, we'll hear from David Eisner, who is its CEO. And Mr. Eisner has now, for several years, been CEO of the corporation and has brought innovative leadership, a strong sense of his past business skills to its mission to grow the national service engine that he leads, but also as a research-minded leader and someone who loves ideas to bring fresh energy and tighter focus to that organization. He was, prior to the corporation, an executive with AOL and AOL Time Warner. Included among his duties was day-to-day management of the AOL Foundation. So he is a practitioner, he is a thought leader, and now he is an important policymaker in the federal government. I'm pleased to call him friend. David, welcome.
Good afternoon. Okay, so Jay's walked you through the challenge that the president set for the country and also for our administration to support the Armies of Compassion. And he mentioned that I used to be at AOL, and AOL actually saw a little piece of this in a smaller way, which was the idea that we created an infrastructure that basically turned tens of millions of people, citizens, users of our goods and services, sort of flipped the tables. And we focused on creating an infrastructure that allowed them to become the producers of the goods and services, the creators of content that all of us, and so we were really focused on that power of what it means to turn citizens into active participants. And it's really exciting to be doing that at the federal level. But I'm painfully aware that I actually know most of the people in this room, that most of you have more than ample opportunities to listen to me meander on, and that I stand between you and some folks that you don't, unfortunately, have as much opportunity to listen to. My boss, Mayor Goldsmith, and some of the terrific folks on the panel. So what I'm going to try to do is talk really fast. And here's what I would like to do. Over the next few minutes, talk a little bit about what's happening in this country since the call to service that Jay spoke about at the beginning of the administration. What we know now as a result of some of our research about America's culture of service and where it's going, and some of the things that we're looking at to do as we move forward. So Jay talked about this remarkable innovation that he's brought to this office, about these ongoing roundtables where you talk about the key challenges. And one thing that we know is we are not short of challenges. We have 18% of America's youth who live at or below the poverty level. We have 20,000 kids aging out of our foster care system every year without an understanding often of what they're going to do, and they may end up homeless or jobless or in jail or worse. We have 10.3 million children of prisoners and people in jail at any given time in this country. Of those, without an intervention, 70% of those kids will themselves end up in prison. We have 760,000 young people involved in gangs, more than 750,000 people coming out of our prisons every year and ending up on the front doorsteps of our communities without a connection to a job or a place to live or a connection to the community. And we have the aging of the community, all these boomers and who represent potentially an expanded burden on our social service systems, but also an opportunity to engage more people in service. And our job, the job of, I feel bound to the words that the president used in the inaugural, where he said, when we see that wounded traveler on the road to Jericho, we will not pass to the other side. And we know that we can't solve these challenges without fully engaging America's citizens. And since the president made that call to service, we've actually made extraordinary progress in shining a spotlight on some of the service that's happening in this country and on making it stronger. One of the most important but subtle things that's happening is that there's a greater mind share, a greater awareness of the importance of civic engagement that starts in the business community, goes through the philanthropic sector into nonprofits, and is also part of government. I think that this concept that Jay and I have been talking about, that service is not just nice but necessary, and that we can't solve problems without the active engagement of our citizens, is something that we're seeing everywhere, from the Surdna Foundation to Atlantic Philanthropies to the Case Foundation, and from businesses like Home Depot, State Farm Insurance, and Target. We're seeing more and more public and private programming to promote civic life in America. And as another example, we're seeing that our partners, that our grantees every year raise just about $400 million on their own. Or put another way, for every dollar that the corporation gives in a grant, our grantees are raising about more than 60 cents. In addition, at the corporation, we're very focused on making sure that national service and our 75,000 AmeriCorps members and 500,000 Senior Corps members and 1.3 million students in service are all about leveraging more volunteers. So that last year, our national service participants trained, recruited, managed about 1.8 million community volunteers directly. And the corporation is also the strongest supporter of the nonprofit volunteer infrastructure groups like Points of Light and Hands-On and RSVP. So together we're leveraging many millions more volunteers. Let me give a quick example of what we mean when we say leverage volunteers and how critical it is. In Madison, Wisconsin, in the mid-1990s, 29% of African American students in third grade scored at minimal levels on achievement tests compared to 5% of white students. Another way of looking at it is that African Americans were more than 35% behind white students in reading scores in third grade. There was a project that had already been working on literacy, and they brought in a few vistas to help them coordinate. Those vistas recruited 700 volunteers from the community. Over multiple years, the 700 volunteers helped work with the third graders and this year reduced the number of African American third graders who scored minimally down to 5%. They reduced the gap from over 35% between white and African American students to less than 4%. So that today the school superintendent in Madison, Wisconsin is able to say that he isn't able to predict failure or success in school based on the race that a child is when they go into school. That's the importance of engaging citizens, and it's what we see as the important role of leveraging. Now today, trying to bring these concepts to scale, we released a study called Volunteering in America, State Trends and Rankings in Civic Life. So since 2002, the good news is that we've seen the volunteer rate go up. And today, we see 61.2 million Americans volunteering. They're serving 8.1 billion hours. And according to the independent sector evaluation of that, that's in excess of $150 billion worth of volunteering. That's extraordinary. But the report also shows us gives us some really tough news in a couple of ways. First, 61.2 million is down from the 65 million that we saw the year earlier. That's not so bad. For several years, 3 years in a row, every year we were marking a new 30-year high. And you can't expect every year to see a 30-year high. What's bad, though, is when you break behind the numbers and you see what's really causing it. Well, the fact is that in 2005, about 31% of the people that had volunteered in 2004 volunteered again. In 2006, I'm sorry, I said 31%. 31% didn't volunteer again. In 2006, more than 36% didn't volunteer again. In other words, we lost for the first time more than a third of the volunteers that served in 2005 did not serve in 2006. Had we maintained the same rate, that 31% dropout rate, we would have had basically the same number of volunteers in 2006 as in 2005. So we have to focus on retention. Now, we learned other good news too. We once again were able to show that higher state volunteer rates led to better health for state residents, longer life, higher life satisfaction, lower rates of depression, greater physical and mental well-being. So we know that volunteering is important to the individuals, it's important to the health of the state, and we have to look for new and creative ways to retain and effectively manage volunteers. The really good news is that we have strong opportunities to do it. We have thriving interest among various segments of the population in volunteering. The boomers, this incredible cohort of 77 million adults, is the healthiest, best educated generation we've seen. It's still highly emotionally connected with President Kennedy's call to service that Jay referenced, and they're very connected to this concept of this era that created VISTA and the Peace Corps. So we have an opportunity to call on them, and they are currently about 50% more likely than that age group was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s to volunteer. So we have a really strong opportunity to go after that group. We've also seen some other phenomena that put wind in our sails. School-based service and service learning has grown like a wildfire. In part, that's because of our Learn and Serve America program. In 1984, before that program started, just 9% of K-12 schools offered service learning. Today, service learning is in more than 1/3 of America's schools, civically engaging millions and millions of students every year. In addition, we've got some demographic trends. operating in the favor of service. More Americans are better educated today than ever before, and education remains a very strong predictor of people serving. And we're seeing Americans having kids later, which is a predictor that volunteering lasts longer in life, and that the cutoff point after the kids leave home seems to be less sharp. But the stats that I find truly mind-boggling are, listen to this, college student volunteering is up 20% in just a few years. And today's 16 to 19-year-olds, they're volunteering 100% more, twice as much as that older teen category did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. That's an extraordinary opportunity that if we get this right, if we focus on the retention issue, we focus on the recruitment issue, we focus on the management issue, we can solve meaningful problems in our communities through service. Now, I want to address one other trend that's discouraging, which is our research recently has identified and really begun to drill into a growing class gap in civic engagement. That is, folks that are well off and well educated are much more likely to be volunteering and serving than folks that are not. Disadvantaged youth are 16% less likely to volunteer or take part in service learning or school civics clubs than their affluent peers. And this is particularly discouraging because it seems to reflect a growing inflexibility in Americans' economic and educational strata. We've never been a class-driven society. One of the things that's always made America great is that you could be born into a poor family that doesn't come from education, and by hard work and education you can raise yourself up. Well, we're seeing that kind of flexibility seems to be eroding a little bit. And that's because now, if you're born into a poor family, you're less likely to trust your neighbors, you're less likely to trust your institutions, you're less likely to have a social network that's supportive, you're less likely to be self-confident, and you're less likely in general to be trusting of people. So all of the ways that people in poverty used to be able to reach out and elevate themselves seem to be less available now. But but it's a really interesting thing that shows, the research also shows us that service is one of the strongest interventions among people, particularly young people, who are trapped this way. And the intervention is twofold, or two ways. First of all, through mentoring and other kinds of direct engagement, service offers a way for people that are able to give back to reach across that strata and actually help people up, help people build their self-confidence, build the skills, build the networks that enable them to succeed. But even more importantly, we are getting stronger and stronger data that shows when we take a youth from a disadvantaged circumstance and we enable them to serve their community, that they get a sense of their own agency, that they build a sense of new networks of social support. They learn hard job skills, soft social skills. They build greater trust in their community, stronger trust in institutions. They become more likely to trust people that they meet. And most importantly, they develop greater sense of self-confidence and a stronger desire to succeed. So we find that service is an incredibly important intervention. Research is showing us in this junction where we're beginning to see at the same time this class gap between who serves and who doesn't. And it means that all of us have to double our efforts as we're reaching out for more people to serve to ensure that we're reaching out to engage those people that need service, not just as a way to feel good about themselves and to give back, but those people that we might otherwise think of as clients or recipients of services, in many ways, those are the folks that we have to engage in service the most. And so where do we find them? Well, it's really interesting. The only thing that youth from disadvantaged circumstances, the only organization that they are as likely to participate in, they're less likely to be in youth groups, they're less likely to be in school, they're less likely to have good teachers, but they go to church. And we find that when we engage disadvantaged youth in service, we're disproportionately doing it out of churches and faith-based organizations. And yet we are now finding more than 85% of nonprofit organizations that engage volunteers do not have a relationship with their local churches or with faith-based institutions, which means that they are structurally disadvantaged in being able to engage the exact people that we want to see serving the most. That's a number that we're going to keep close track of in the future. Let me note two things. When we, before I turn it back over to Steve. First of all, when we talk about engaging citizens, all of this research shows us that it has to be as much about training our nonprofits about the right way to engage and hold their citizens as it is about actual recruitment to folks. And the two things that we have to get across, I believe, to the nonprofit community is first, increasingly, people want to serve in ways that are meaningfully connected to solving key problems in their society. They want to be able to see and touch and understand why their volunteer work is connected to being an important part of the local solution. And secondly, we're seeing that volunteers want to be trained and supervised and managed and thanked the way we would thank any professional colleague or any person that we value. Too often, we see nonprofit organizations that will manage a $1 million gift through their CEO and their board of directors, but will manage $5 million worth of volunteering resources through their interns. That is not the right way to stimulate strong retention, and it's not the right way to actually meaningfully solve problems in our communities through volunteers. The second thing that I'd like to say is when you really focus on where is the growth in volunteering going to happen over the next 5-10 years, it's pretty strong. We have an opportunity, if we can push with disadvantaged youth, turn them from clients into assets, we can set off sort of a viral opportunity to make change in our communities. Second, if we work really hard, we can make sure that the boomers for the next 30, 40 years are literally doubling the amount of volunteer capacity that we have in the country. Third, we got to focus on our college campuses. If we can drive service learning into colleges and make it make colleges help their communities and make service part of what kids take out of college, we can see this generation growing for a long time. And fourth, from the corporation's point of view, we've set a goal that by 2010, we'd like to see 75 million Americans volunteering. We know it's hard, but we think we can get there. And we're really excited about the continued support toward this mission from across the administration. I hope a lot of you have seen how many cabinet secretaries and senior officials are participating in volunteer service during this volunteer week. And I am very grateful to the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives for continuing to help push this across the compassion agenda, and very grateful to Freedom Corps for their leadership on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Very fine words. The Honorable Stephen Goldsmith has had a long distinguished career in public service. He was a prosecutor in Marion County, Central Indiana in the 1980s. He was a very innovative mayor in Indianapolis in the 1990s. He led in the areas of privatization and other strategies that made Indianapolis a more efficient city and indeed a more caring city. He was acknowledged by Governing Magazine as a Public Official of the Year, so it wasn't just us who were close to him that saw how remarkable his leadership was. He has been identified for quite some time as a leading national innovator who has created partnerships in his community with faith-based and community organizations. One of his innovations in Indianapolis is hopefully something he'll be addressing and sharing with us today, a program called Porch Alliance, which actually probably isn't even a program. It was really just a strategy because it wasn't focused on dollars, it was focused on relationship. I worked for a think tank in Indianapolis while Mayor Goldsmith was mayor and in the city hall, and a secret that I'll share with you is when you work at a think tank, you're supposed to know more than the public officials that you're working with. But we'd go and meet with Mayor Goldsmith, and he's read the latest research, and so the wow factor was muted considerably with him, to be sure. So we left town and worked with other public officials that we could tell them some new stories, perhaps. But Mayor Goldsmith now is chairman of the Corporation for National Community Service Board, as you've heard. He teaches Tuesdays and Thursdays classes at Harvard, where he also leads the Innovations in American Government program that Ford Foundation has sponsored and identifies new practices even today on how we can, as a government, reach out more effectively to the citizens who have needs in our communities. So without further ado, let me welcome Mayor Steve Goldsmith.
Thanks for the kind introduction, but you left out the most important element. Did you vote for me? Oh, I'm so sorry. The best I can tell from Jay's introduction and David's remarks, he's the future and I'm the past. I'm going to tell you what we did, and he's going to tell you, he told you what we planned to do. So let me, I think it'd be helpful, Jay, to talk a little bit about the framing that kind of created